So, if you recall from the previous lecture on social disorganization theory, particularly around Sean McKay, Sampson and Groves, and Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earls, I identified some of the significant criticisms that social disorganization theorists received. Specifically, they neglected how macro level decisions were made that shaped the development of poverty, family disruption, heterogeneity, lack of home ownership in those communities. Instead, they focus solely on informal social control, social networks or social capital, and social ties, making those theories meso-level theories because they're focusing on the community. Now, Sampson and Wilson in 1995, and yes, this is the same Sampson of Sampson and Groves and Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earls, and you'll be hearing a lot from Sampson because he's written a lot of criminological theories. But Sampson and Wilson in 1995 wrote a theory called race, crime, and urban inequality. And unlike the other social disorganization theorists, this theory focuses on macro level factors. They describe how certain policies and certain decisions in government have caused poverty, family disruption, and residential instability. Now, I know this slide is a bit chaotic. I hope you follow along in the lecture and take good notes. So, Sampson and Wilson in 1995 wrote Race, Crime, and Urban Inequality. And unlike other social disorganization theories, their theory takes into account macro level factors. And they describe how certain macro level factors and macro level decisions, so decisions made by governments, decisions such as laws, policies, and regulations, have shaped poverty, family disruption, and residential stability. These laws, policies, and regulations also inhibited many ethnic and racial groups moving out of what we now think of as the inner city. So if you recall, Sean McKay, Sampson and Groves, even Park and Burgess talk about how the succession from zone 2 into the other zones is a quite natural process. And so we now know that certain ethnic and racial groups have not been able to move out of those inner cities. And Sampson and Wilson describe how certain macro level decisions has caused that to happen. Here you can see a very chaotic slide. On the left, you have your macro level factors. These are the certain policies that have caused some of the problems in these inner city communities. So the first one is deindustrialization. What has happened in the United States is that we have shifted our economy from a goods producing economy to a service economy. What that means is we manufacture minimal amounts of goods in this country. We import way more products than we had in the past. Instead, our economy is based on services. In other words, most of the jobs out there are service jobs. So you think about being a cleaning person, working in a cafe or a McDonald's, nail salons, spas, hotel management. These are all services provided to the people. We also have seen, Sampson and Wilson describe, is the polarization of the labor market, which means that at one end, you have people making very little money, so very low wages, and at the other end, you have excessively high wages. So this is kind of like, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the removal of the middle class, where we seem to have either lower class or high class. The next policy shift has been in the relocation of manufacturing jobs. Now, many of you know this already, that in many cities we used to have manufacturing jobs. Cars used to be built in Detroit, right? You've had steel in Pittsburgh, for example. You had a goods producing economy. But a lot of those manufacturing jobs have been relocated to other countries for lower wages and increasing in profit, leaving many cities without an economy. No jobs are present in those cities. Next is racial segregation. So many of you are from the LA area, so I'm sure you recognize how racially and ethnically segregated the city is. It is very easy to drive around LA and never see certain groups of people. Racial segregation is a result of two significant policies. One is the shift in public housing projects, where you have all of these individuals who are on public housing living in the same community. So you can racially and financially segregate a whole group of people. Racial segregation is also the result of Section 8 housing, in which Section 8 housing is only available in certain communities. Then you have housing discrimination. So housing discrimination has also led to racial segregation. So even though the United States has laws protecting against housing discrimination still occurs at the ground level. For example, a white person comes into a real estate agent office with the same portfolio to purchase a house as a black person. That real estate agent is going to show both of those couples different homes based on their race. So they will, for example, show the black buyer homes in predominantly black neighborhoods, while the white buyer will be shown homes in predominantly white neighborhoods, which leads to racial segregation and is housing discrimination. The other form of housing discrimination occurs with the seller. So the seller of the home will refuse to sell, perhaps to a black person, or refuse to sell the home to a white person, which is also another form of housing discrimination that can lead to racial segregation. Another macro level factor has been middle class flight, in which economically stable families, even those who are ethnically and racially similar to the communities in which they live, will move out of those communities instead of remaining in those communities, which makes it harder for those communities to escape its conditions. Finally is the lack of investment. You think about the kind of jobs that are available in those communities. You have few businesses moving into those communities without gentrifying that community. So you could potentially have businesses moving in, hiring people from those communities to work there, and really building the city or the community. But instead, you have businesses coming in, they buy the property, and they force many of the people living there to leave. So as a result of these macro level factors, Sampson and Wilson describe that these communities experience concentrated disadvantage. They have concentrated poverty, high rates of family disruption, and residential instability. This concentration leads to three effects on the community: structural social disorganization, cultural social isolation, and cultural disorganization. So structural social disorganization. So if you remember what social disorganization meant, right? It's the inability of a community to realize its common values. When there is a prevalence and interdependence of social networks, whether they be formal or informal, in a community, you're less likely to have structural social disorganization. The lack of interdependency, the lack of prevalence of these social networks becomes a systemic problem. So the local community, its networks, are not able to effectively socialize the individuals in that community. You think about what networks provide for you, what your social ties provide for you. Your social ties provide links to a variety of resources in your life. This goes back to Sean McKay, right? That through social ties, you have links. You have a friend who can get you a job. You have a friend's dad who can get you an internship. You have access to money, or you have access to different homes for trips. You have, someone who knows someone in a law firm who could help you with a lawyer if you so needed one. That is your social network. If your social network is small or absent, then there's going to be both constraints and a lack of opportunity for jobs, for involvement in quality schools, to find a good partner, and you won't have exposure to strong role models. And that's structural social disorganization. This concentrated disadvantage also leads to cultural social isolation. In other words, communities are socially isolated. They have a lack of contact and sustained interaction with conventional institutions. They have no resources, no role models, no social networks, which means they are essentially cut off from mainstream society, which means they don't earn any capital, not human capital, which is an individual skill set, not social capital, which is their networks, not economic capital, which means wealth or assets, nor cultural capital, which essentially is your ability to communicate outside of your own community. When you're culturally and socially isolated, you are cut off from the daily routines that kids in affluent areas take for granted. You're less likely to go to college, get a job, get married, and do so in that order, as expected. You're so isolated that other communities, other groups of people fear you. So again, this concentrated disadvantage causes cultural disorganization, meaning there is attenuation of societal cultural values. Crime becomes tolerated. It's a part of your everyday life. The result are these crime-inducing cognitive landscapes. Individuals living in these communities have ecologically structured norms, meaning norms that have been created based on the communities in which they live. So they have these ecologically structured norms that are less apt to assign negative sanctions to violence and illegal conduct. As a consequence, crime happens, and crime is prevalent in these communities. So just to iterate, you have these macro level decisions and policies and regulations, or lack thereof, that have led to concentrated disadvantage. Because of this concentrated disadvantage, the community is structurally and socially disorganized, they are culturally and socially isolated, and they are culturally disorganized, which leads to crime-inducing cognitive landscapes, which allows crime to happen. You think about these kinds of communities, violence and crime is entrenched in their lives. All they know, all they see is crime and violence. They don't have other role models. They're isolated from conventional institutions. They don't have opportunities. They have been restricted of these opportunities because they lack interdependence of social networks. They're culturally disorganized. They tolerate crime. They tolerate violence. And that's Sampson and Wilson's Race, Crime, and Urban Inequality. So you see how these ethnic groups and racial groups have not been able to leave these communities despite the desire to do so, because they face housing segregation, discrimination. The polarization of the labor market has left them at the bottom of the wage gap.